in the realm of intellectual property as a whole, not just copyright, but there's this notion that when a society grows up, suddenly they get an intellectual property regime, right? Let's talk about the early days of U.S. intellectual property, specifically copyright. Were there pirated works? Absolutely. The culture was designed back then for sharing. Sharing. Again, whether it was early silent films, player piano rolls, pirated copies of Mark Twain's book, pirated copies of Webster's Dictionary. This has been around since the beginning. And because there's no regimes or central organization that exists in the very beginnings of any country, including the United States, sharing is the method by which we pass information to each other. It's the way books spread to California. It's the way books spread to Louisiana. You know, we shared, and a lot of people have tracked through newspapers articles that made their way from Vermont to Texas that were absolutely plagiarized, right? And stories and tales and stuff like this. But this is how we spread information and culture then. Then at some point we grow up, right? I mean, it's not really growing up, but it's realizing it's when the sharing tips over into the protection of rights. And no person represents a better example of this during his lifetime than Mark Twain. Mark Twain, in the very beginning of his career, when he's first writing stories and being the character that he was in his earlier years, he would say things like, I've never had an original idea. Everyone's stolen a little bit from everyone. Don't quote me on that's exactly what he said, but it's something along those lines. And he relied on the sharing and the telling and the retelling of tales. Later, he goes before Congress, sometime when he was in his 60s, I guess, and asked Congress to pass a Copyright Act that would basically be permanent copyright. He wants his grandchildren's grandchildren to be able to get proceeds off of the sale of his books. So at that point, his books had started to become pirated in Canada and other parts of the United States, and he wasn't seeing profit off of that. So, in his particular struggle, we see the exact struggle in our own society, in that we did eventually sign on to the Berne Convention, which has this 3-step test, and it can be ugly, but I guess that's the point by which we said, okay, we're ready to have a real regime now because we have enough rights holders that really are tired of the piracy and the sharing and want to enforce some sort of rights. Now we balance that out with our very own copyright, Fair Use Act, our 108 rights, our exceptions for sale doctrine, all that was built in to kind of balance that out, but it's one of the methods, I think, by which a society grows up.